All right, I'm gonna just review everything Toronto teached us. So, an ecosystem is a community of living organisms that interact with the non-living things in the environment. So, for example, if let's say if we have a forest, if we have a forest, well, what are some living things in the forest? What are some living organisms? Well, we have grass. Any sort of plant is considered a living organism. You have the trees, you have the actual animals in the forest. So let's say if, I don't know, a raccoon lives in the forest, that would classify as a living organism. And for non-living things in the environment, well, what are some non-living things in a forest? Well, you have sunlight. Sunlight's not living, but it's very important for an ecosystem. If you have a lot of sunlight, well, some places like deserts have so much sunlight that plants can't really live there, and certain animals can't really live in a desert because, well, they can't really adapt to how much sunlight there is. It's too hot for them. Well, we also have rainfall. The more rain there is in some type of environment, well, it can boost plant growth, for example. You also have rocks. Rocks. You have, let's say, soil. And soil is actually living and non-living, believe it or not. So soil is living because soil has sort of tiny decomposers in it, but soil is also non-living because it's full of nutrients. Nutrients are non-living, but the things inside of soil, like those little bugs you see if you zoom in on soil, they're living. So soil is actually non-living and living at the same time. Non-living things are biotic. That's just a special name they call. Living things are biotic, and non-living things are abiotic. That's just a fancy way of saying biotic's just a fancy way of saying something's living, and abiotic is just a fancy way of saying something is not living. Okay, now let's talk about predator-prey relationships. So obviously, in an ecosystem, if we look at a forest, we just use the same example, there's going to be a predator and there's going to be a prey. Definitely heard of this before. The prey is the thing that's getting eaten by the predator. So for example, if you have something like a fox and a rabbit, if the fox eats the rabbit, the fox is considered the predator and the rabbit is considered the prey. Another example, let's say if you have a goat and the goat eats grass. This is actually another predator-prey relationship. The goat is the predator and the grass is the prey because the goat is eating the grass. So whatever's the predator is getting energy from whatever's the prey. In this case, the goat is getting its energy from the grass. Therefore, the grass is the prey and the goat's the predator. Okay. Now, in an ecosystem, certain animals have certain relationships with each other that aren't predator-prey relationships. And these are called symbiotic relationships. So symbiotic relationships are not the same as predator and prey relationship. They're different. So don't get that confused. One type of symbiotic relationship is mutualism. And this is basically when you have two animals that benefit from each other. So that's why I'm writing these two positive signs. For example, let's say if we have a rhino. This right over here is my rhino. And this rhino has ticks on it. So let's say there's some ticks on the rhino. And we have a bird on the rhino. Okay. Now you have a rhino infested with ticks, and you have a bird. Now the relationship between this bird and this rhino is an example of mutualism. And what happens is this bird starts eating some of the ticks on the rhino. So it eats all the ticks on the rhino. Now, how is the rhino benefiting from this relationship? Well, obviously, if you got ticks sucking on your blood and you got something that removes the ticks from your body, I'd say that's a pretty beneficial thing. So the rhino is benefiting from this relationship. And the bird, well, because it's eating the ticks, it's getting energy, it's getting its food. So this bird is also benefiting from this relationship. So this is an example of mutualism. So right over here, I've drawn a diagram. And commensalism is when one species benefits while the other species doesn't get affected. So right over here, I've drawn a diagram of a blue whale and some barnacles on the whale. Now, barnacles, they attach on to the blue whale. And they're not really like ticks. They're not ticks where, they suck the blood from the whale. They just latch onto the whale and they don't really do anything else. And this is a commensalism relationship because the whale isn't really affected by these barnacles. But meanwhile, the barnacles, they get protection from predators because the whale is constantly moving. So the barnacles, the predator of the barnacles, something that eats barnacles, will have a hard time actually eating the barnacles because they're on the blue whale. And finally, the simplest one is parasitism. And this is when, this right over here, it looks pretty similar to parasite. So it's probably not something good. And that's true. Parasitism is when one species benefits while the other species does not benefit. So for example, if you have a mosquito, or let's say a tick, for example, on you, and it's sucking the blood out of you, well, the tick is benefiting. However, you, the human, is losing blood, right? So that's not good. Or another example, have you ever heard of tapeworms? Have y'all ever heard of tapeworms? There's these little worms that live inside your stomach, and they basically eat a lot of your nutrients. So the tapeworm, in this case, is benefiting, while you, the human, it's not going to be a good time for you. So that's parasitism. Okay. Now, let's look at predator. Let's look at predator, prey, oscillation, predator-prey oscillation, things, charts, whatever. So I'm going to draw a graph right over here. And on the x-axis of my graph, this represents time. I'm not going to be specific with the time. Just know that time is always moving forward. Okay, so in this graph, time is always moving forward. And on the y-axis, this represents prey. This is the prey or the predator population size. Population size. Okay, so in this case, let's say that we have a predator, and I'm going to use a red line to indicate that it's a predator. And I'm going to use a blue line to indicate that it's prey. Okay. So let's say that the prey is a snail. Actually, let's say the prey is a rabbit. And let's say the predator is a fox or a wolf. Yeah, it's actually perfect. Now, if you were to put a wolf and a rabbit in an ecosystem, let's say like in a forest, for example, and you were to track the population of wolves and the population of rabbits over a certain period of time, the graph of this would actually look something like this. So let's say this is the wolf. The red represents the wolf population, and then the blue, let's say they start the same. The blue represents the rabbit population. So you'll notice how the rabbit and the wolves, right? When the wolf population is very high, the rabbit population is low. And when the rabbit population is very high, the wolf population is low. Now, why is this? Okay, so you've just put a bunch of wolves into an ecosystem with rabbits. Now, what's going to happen to the population of rabbits? Well, the wolves are going to eat the rabbits. So therefore, the population of rabbits is going to slowly decrease, while the amount of wolves, because they're getting food and they're going to keep on reproducing. So the population of wolves is going to increase. Now, eventually, there's going to be a point where you have too many wolves. So imagine if you have 50 wolves, but you only have like 3 rabbits to eat. You have 3 rabbits to eat, there's 50 wolves. So obviously, some of the wolves are going to die of starvation. And this is why the wolf population is going to slowly decrease, while the rabbit population is slowly going to make its way back up. Because, well, there's just these couple of rabbits, they're going to just hide, and these wolves won't really get any food, right? So there's going to be a couple of rabbits that are going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and once again, the rabbit population is now high, while the wolf population is dying out. And once again, you'll see this cycle continues. The wolves then eat the rabbit, rabbit's population goes down, wolf repopulates, then wolves starve to death, and then rabbits repopulate. So that's predator-prey oscillations. Oscillating, it just means that it goes up and down in between certain values. So you notice how it's like a wave. It goes up until a certain value, then down into a certain value, and it's like this wave. Okay. Now, back to the point of this. So, the thing I mentioned about, let's say if you have 50 wolves, right, and you only have 3 rabbits to feed them. Well, this is something called competition. When you have, in this case, multiple animals, it can be of the same species, it can be different species, but just when you have one animal or many animals competing for the same food, they want to eat the same food, well, that's something called competition. It's like if you're placed in a room with your friends, right? It's like if you're with your friends and you're fighting for the last pizza slice. That's an example of competition. Okay. So, competition between different species, well, that's called interspecific competition. While competition between different species, that's called intra-specific competition. All right. So I'm going to just create another graph right now. So if we have, let's say, time, actually, not time. I'm going to create a graph. And on the x-axis, this represents resource use. And then on the y-axis, this is going to be resource availability. And this kind of makes sense why this is on the x-axis and this is on the y-axis. Because the amount of resource that you have depends on the amount of resource that you use. So this is the independent variable and this is the dependent variable. Now imagine if one species, uses a bit of energy, a bit of resources. Let me just call this population number 1. So imagine if you have a population of, let's say, rabbits that use some amount of resources and there's a lot of resources left. However, you have another species of rabbits. That use this many resources, and they have this much available. Now, what you notice about these two graph thingies I drew is that there's this intersection point. And this intersection point represents the competition between two species. This intersection point represents competition because some species from this population and some species from this population are fighting for similar resource uses. So that explains why whenever two species are in competition with one another, there's not much resource availability left, right? You notice how in this point right over here, because these two species are fighting for the same resource, well, there's not much resource available left, right? They're all trying to steal something, all trying to eat. You feel what I'm saying? Okay. Now, it's no surprise that if you have two animals in competition with one another, someone's got to win. Let's say that if we have a graph where time is on our x-axis and the population is on our y-axis. And let's say that if the blue line represents species number 1 and the red line represents species number 2. Now, whenever two species are in competition with one another, a lot of times someone's going to win. And if you were looking at the graph, you'll notice how the population of number 1 eventually, over some period of time, is now greater than the population of number 2. And this means that species number 1 kind of won the resource battle. It won the competition. And this kind of makes sense, right? If species number 1, let's say, was faster at getting food than species number 2, what's going to happen is number 1 is going to get more and more and more resources. It's going to get more resources than number 2. So it's going to reproduce more and more and more with this extra food that it has. Meanwhile, number 2, because it's slower than species number 1, well, it's not going to have that as much resources. Therefore, a lot of the species is going to die out, and the population of number two would be lower than the population of number one. Now we talked about abiotic factors, the non-living factors inside the ecosystem. We said there was rocks, we said there was sunlight, different amounts of rain, which are non-living factors. And non-living factors are important because they determine the environment that an animal can be in. So for example, if you have an environment where it's very hot, so there's a lot of sunlight, there's a lot of sunlight, there's not a lot of rain, so not a lot of precipitation, and not a lot of soil, well, you wouldn't see a polar bear living here. And right now I'm actually describing a desert. A desert, there's a lot of sunlight, there's not much rain, and you won't see that much soil. And you wouldn't see a polar bear living in a desert because all of these non-living factors, all of these abiotic factors sort of determine what animals can live there, what plants can live there. And these different sort of environments are classified as biomes. So each biome has different abiotic factors that can determine which animal lives in what area. Okay, now the first biome I'm going to be talking to you about, and actually, hold up, before we do this, biomes can be split into two categories. You have biomes that are in the water, which are called aquatic biomes. For example, our ocean is an example of an aquatic biome. Meanwhile, you can also have biomes on land, also called terrestrial biome. So let's talk about terrestrial biomes first, the land biomes. First one is the tundra. And the tundra, you can think about it as the opposite of the desert. It's very cold, and it's usually like negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not have a lot of rain. It gets less than 10 inches of rain per year, and it relies on the snow because it snows quite a lot, and it uses snow for moisture. And because it's so cold, you won't usually see a lot of plants living there. But however, you'll notice some tiny growing grass or moss. But other than that, there's not really much plants there. You can also have things like polar bears, Arctic foxes, right? Some examples of tundras are the North Pole, Antarctica, right? So there are some animals like polar bears and foxes, Arctic foxes, that have adapted to survive in this environment. The tundra is also home to permafrost, and permafrost is just the part of the ground 3 feet deep that remains permanently frozen. So if I have this ground right over here, 3 feet below it, the rest of this area right over here would be frozen. Next one is the taiga, and this is also called the boreal forest. And it's a forest found in the northern hemisphere, the high latitudes, and it includes parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. And it has long, cold winters. So during the winters, it's cold, but it's not like tundra level cold. However, it can range from negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's home to tall trees, it has dense leaves, and it's the second coldest biome. Next one is the temperate rainforest. And these are a biome that has moderate temperatures, like 30 to 50 degrees, and they're not really common, but the different types of species there, well, it's a very diverse biome. So there's a lot of different animals living there. The soil is low in nutrients, though, but there's a lot of rainfall in this rainforest. So you'll notice quite a bit of plants growing there. The woodland, also known as the shrubland, it's found in southern California, Australia, South America, and they're unique because they have hot and dry summers combined with rainy winters. So they have extreme weather sometimes, like droughts, wildfires, and this abiotic factor of these droughts and these wildfires, it basically forces the animals living there to have drought resistant traits. So the animals living there have to kind of be used to dryness of the drought, or the adapting to a new habitat, for example, after a wildfire. A tropical rainforest, probably heard of it. It's a warm, wet biome, and it's near the equator. And the temperature here is very, very consistent. It's usually hot and humid, and there's a lot of rain. Now, the soil in this biome, there's not really much nutrients in the soil because, well, there's a lot of trees in this rainforest because there's a lot of rain. So therefore, all these trees are competing for nutrients in the soil, and because there's so many of it, well, the soil is kind of stripped from a lot of nutrients. This ecosystem is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems. Probably it is the most biodiverse ecosystem out there. And biodiversity basically just means the diversity of the animals. Basically, how many different species are living there in the ecosystem. And there's quite a lot. Tropical seasonal forest, also called a savanna. Savannas, they have varying levels of rain. Sometimes in the summer, there's not much rain, but other times, like in the spring or maybe the end of winter, there's quite a bit of rain. And the warm temperatures, they lead to this rich soil composition, and this dry climate prevents many plants, a lot of large plants, from growing. So you notice how there's a couple of trees in this diagram, however, you wouldn't see like a forest growing here. And there's a lot of common animals you've probably seen in like a movie displaying the savannah. For example, you'll notice a lion living in savannas, you'll notice elephants, zebras, giraffes living in savannas, you have ostriches, hyenas there. So there's a quite bit of biodiversity in savannas. Now, aquatic biomes, they can also be split into two categories. You have saltwater biomes, saltwater aquatic biomes, and saltwater aquatic biomes are also called marine biomes, while non-saltwater biomes are called freshwater aquatic biomes. So let's talk about freshwater aquatic biomes first. So in this, you have ponds, you have lakes. Lakes and ponds, kind of the same thing, except that lakes are bigger than ponds. You have streams, and you have rivers. It's kind of the same deal here. Rivers are basically just a bigger version of streams. And you also have wetlands. And in wetlands, you have marshes. Marshes don't have trees, so they're non-woody. Swamps, they do have a lot of trees. And you have bogs, which are acidic. Now, these are freshwater biomes, the freshwater ocean biomes. The freshwater aquatic biomes. And you have the marine aquatic biomes. So in this case, you have in saltwater aquatic biomes, you have estuaries. Estuaries are kind of like the transition point between a river and the ocean. So if you have like a river here and you have like the ocean here, this transition point right over here would be an estuary. Intertidal zone. And basically, this is the point. This is right over here. This represents low tide. You know how like ocean waves, sometimes they can be very aggressive, right? Sometimes it can go all the way over here. While sometimes the ocean waves only go a little part of this area right over here. So whenever there's high tide, that means that the ocean waves are splashing very far along this beach. And low tide means that they're not splashing as far on this beach. And this intertidal zone is this zone in between low tide and high tide. And obviously, this intertidal zone well, the animals living there have to be how do I say it? They gotta adapt well. They have to adapt well to the harsh conditions. Okay. Because you have some moments, imagine if you're an animal living here. You have some moments where you have so much water, right? If you're an animal living here. Some moments where you have so much water rushing to you. And you have some moments where you barely have any water at all. So in the intertidal zone is very harsh conditions. And you also have coral reefs. Coral reefs. They're usually in warm, shallow water. Okay, warm, shallow water. Okay. And in the marine biomes, you can also have wetlands as well. So swamps can fall into this category right over here. So saltwater biomes, there can be also salty swamps, salty bogs, salty marshes, but there can also be freshwater marshes and etc. Okay, let's talk about features of a lake. So the first zone we're talking about is the littoral zone. And this zone is basically where a lot of plants, a lot of animals can live. This part is on land. So all of this area right over here is land, and then this is the soil. Now this land area near this pond is very biodiverse, and it supports a lot of plants and animals. Then you have the limnetic zone. So we're getting further away from this littoral zone right over here we talked about. And this is actually, believe it or not, where most photosynthesis takes place. And you have phytoplankton, you have freshwater fish, you have zooplankton living here. Now, as you get deeper into this pond, you're going to reach the profundo zone. And in this zone, because you're very deep in the water, and for any of y'all that haven't gone diving yet, the deeper that you go into the water, well, the darker it's going to be. And there's not going to be as much sunlight in this part of the air, in this part of the pond, which means that there's not going to be a lot of photosynthesis happening, because plants need photosynthesis to create glucose, to create energy for themselves. But because there's not much sunlight down there, well, there's not going to be much animals that do photosynthesis down there. And the water in this zone is cooler, and this supports fish that are adapted to these cooler waters. And finally, you have the beneathic zone. Beneathic zone contains, this is underground, by the way, so this is below the littoral zone. And what happens here is this is where the decomposers are at. So for example, if a plant died, well, this plant, these decomposers like bacteria, fungi, worms, what they would do is they would release the nutrients, right? They would use the nutrients of this dead plant and they would convert it into organic matter that would be used by, let's say, the soil. And this soil, well, the nutrients from the soil would be used to fuel other plants. Let's talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle is a biogeochemical process, and carbon is an element. It's an element on the periodic table. So what this big word basically means is we're kind of exploring how carbon travels around living things like plants, how it can travel inside the dirt, it can travel in oceans, and let's talk about it. So before we start, I'm gonna need you to know two processes. First process, photosynthesis. Take some CO2, and this is what plants do. They take some CO2, they take some water, they take some sunlight because you need energy to fuel this reaction, and in return you get oxygen gas and glucose, which is basically the plant's energy. And this right over here, I'm just gonna call it CR, abbreviation for cellular respiration. This is what every living being basically does. You take some glucose and you take some oxygen gas and you create carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is energy. So let's see how carbon cycles throughout our atmosphere. To everywhere. Now, the reason why carbon is so important is because every organic compound has carbon. So, for example, carbon's in your DNA. Carbon is in your cells. And without carbon, you wouldn't have energy, right? This reaction right over here wouldn't even exist if you did not have. So this is a very important process. Now, carbon dioxide is found, first of all, we start out in the atmosphere. Atmosphere is made out of 0.04% carbon. It's not much in it. And what happens is, well, let's look at the photosynthesis formula. What plants do is they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and in return, they release oxygen gas back into the atmosphere. So taking the CO2 to make energy. Now, one day, this tree right over here is going to die. Let's say this is a dead tree. Well, what's going to happen is decomposers, like stuff like bacteria, is going to get all the juicy nutrients out from this tree. So it's going to basically get all the carbon, get all the nitrogen, get all the important stuff out of this dead tree. And some carbon will go back to the atmosphere after decomposition, while some carbon will remain inside the soil and be turned into fossil fuels. So some carbon from these dead plants, or even dead animals in general, they can be turned into fossil fuels. And we know that fossil fuels take a long time to form, like 100 million years. And we're using fossil fuels as energy, as you can see, which is bad because at this rate, we're going to run out of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are used as energy. However, this energy takes 100 million years to form, and we're using so much of it in like a year's time. So by the time like a couple of fossil fuels are formed, like we basically have ran out of fossil fuels. We're not going to have that energy. So burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, imagine if you have a human that eats grass. Now, actually, that's a bad example. Okay. Imagine if you have a goat that eats grass, okay? Now, this goat right over here is consuming a plant. And we know that plants, they have carbon dioxide in them, right? Due to photosynthesis, right? Plants have carbon dioxide in them. So when animals are eating the plant, they're also gaining the carbon dioxide. From the plant, yeah. When animals are eating the plant, they're gaining the carbon dioxide from the plant. And while the animal starts breathing, right, because all this goat right over here is breathing, well, what's happening is they're getting oxygen, they're getting some glucose, and they're breathing out CO2. So they are breathing out CO2. We humans do that as well. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out CO2. And the CO2 can go back into the atmosphere, or it can go back in the plant. Okay. Finally, last part, carbon can also go from the atmosphere to the ocean, where photosynthesis can also happen here because, well, we have stuff like plankton, and plankton does photosynthesis. So you have that, and you can also have decomposition here. Like animals here can also die, and CO2 would be released. It's kind of like the soil situation. Carbon dioxide can also dissolve in the water, and it can go all the way down here where it can become rock, specifically limestone. So that's the carbon cycle. Okay, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen cycle, it starts out in the atmosphere. It's just like carbon cycle. And then the first step is called nitrogen fixation. Actually, before I explain the steps, I gotta explain what's happening first. So nitrogen, in its natural form, it's found as N2, which is nitrogen gas. And nitrogen is an important element. It's found in DNA. It's found in our proteins. So it's very important for survival. Now, nitrogen, I think it's like 78%, 77, 70 something percent of our atmosphere. So it makes up a lot of our atmosphere, believe it or not. Some of y'all might have thought that oxygen actually makes up most of our atmosphere. But that's not actually true. It's mostly nitrogen. Now, nitrogen as N2 is pretty darn useless. But some sort of, let's say, nitrogen, right? It goes into this soil, let's just say. And what happens is that this nitrogen gets fixed. Nitrogen fixation. What this means is this nitrogen is converted into a form of nitrogen that's more useful, specifically ammonia, NH3. So some sort of bacteria in the soil fixes this nitrogen into ammonia. And this ammonia gets converted into ammonium, by another kind of bacteria, NH4 plus, ammonia. So yeah, that's basically the first two steps: a fixation, nitrogen fixation, and ammonification. It's basically when nitrogen is converted from a useless form to a more better form for other, like plants, let's just say plants. Now, what happens is, once again, nitrogen gets converted by bacteria to nitrite and then to nitrate. This is nitrification. So you notice how most of the nitrogen cycle is just nitrogen being converted into different stuff, different compounds. Now, nitrates are very useful. They are used for plants and they help plants grow. Okay, so this is the form of nitrogen that plants use. And when plants take up this nitrogen, it's called assimilation. And obviously, if you have nitrogen in a plant, right, because this, let's just say this plant absorbed the nitrogen from the soil to the roots and everything, well, if a rabbit comes and eats this plant, it's going to absorb this nitrogen as well. And when this rabbit eventually dies, well, this nitrogen is going to be back in the soil. It's going to be back in the soil due to decomposers. And then the cycle sort of continues. Finally, the last step of the cycle is denitrification. So let me write this down. Denitrification. And that's basically when nitrogen is converted from NO3 minus back to N2. So it's this step right over here. So yeah, that's the nitrogen cycle. It's basically nitrogen being converted into more useful forms for stuff like plants to use. In fact, nitrogen is actually found in fertilizer. So yeah, let me just do a quick recap of what we did. So first off, nitrogen goes into soil, and what happens is that nitrogen gets fixed into ammonia, which then gets turned into ammonium due to ammonification. Then it turns into nitrite and then nitrate. This is nitrification. Now this nitrate can be used by plants, and this is assimilation. If a rabbit eats a plant, it dies, nitrogen goes back into the soil, this process repeats, and nitrates sometimes can get converted into atmospheric nitrogen, N2, and then we're back in this cycle again. Now, a cool way that nitrates can turn back into nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, is lightning, believe it or not. So lightning strikes somewhere, and this nitrite is turned back into atmospheric nitrogen. It's one of the non-living ways, one of the abiotic ways of denitrification. Okay, now just a couple more extra points. So when you have this dead rabbit that decomposes and then it goes back into, let's say, ammonia, this process is called mineralization. Mineralization. Let me just type it out because I'm lazy. So this is mineralization. Okay. And we never talk about nitrogen in the ocean. So let me draw a picture of the ocean here. 50% of nitrogen, let's just say about 50%, is going to be used by these plants. However, the other 50%, well, it's going to be carried away by waterways. So in this case, if this was a river, this nitrogen is going to be carried away. And when nitrogen is in this water, you have a lot of it, it can cause something called an algal bloom, algae bloom, whatever. Now, I just said that nitrogen is very important for plant growth, right? It's used in fertilizers. So if you have algae in the ocean, which is basically plants, right? You have these plants in the ocean. What happens is, with so much nitrogen coming inside of this, let's just say, ocean, what happens is you're going to get way more of these plants. They're going to grow more. And as a result, what happens is a lot of these, because it grows so rapidly, it takes so many nutrients, it takes up so many nutrients. Eventually, what's going to happen is these plants are going to run out of nutrients, and then they're going to die. They're all going to die, right? It's sort of like the predator-prey relationship I talked about earlier. You have too much predators, well, then the predators are going to starve because they're not going to have enough nutrients, and therefore their population is going to decrease. It's kind of like the same case here. You have way too many plants because of the nitrogen, but you don't have enough nutrients to actually support the plants. So all of these plants die, and they go to the bottom of the lake. And what happens is decomposers at the bottom of the lake, they require oxygen to decompose all of this. So if this is a decomposer, this is a decomposer. All of these are decomposers. They're going to use a lot of oxygen. They're going to take in a lot of oxygen. All right. They're going to take a lot of oxygen to actually decompose this. And therefore, the oxygen level in this ocean is going to decrease. And that causes big problems. Phosphorus and nitrogen are limiting factors in ecosystems. And limiting factors are just factors that determine if an ecosystem will be productive or not. And it turns out that phosphorus and nitrogen are both used in fertilizers, so they're essential for plant growth. So if you have an ecosystem with a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen, it's going to be pretty productive. And if you don't have a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen in an ecosystem, chances are it's not going to be that productive. That's why it's called a limiting factor, because if you don't have enough of phosphorus and nitrogen in an ecosystem, well, that's going to limit the amount of plants, the amount of animals that you have in your ecosystem. Let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus in nature is usually found in the form of a phosphate. And phosphates are important. For example, if you have ATP, we all know that's energy. ATP's real name is adenosine triphosphate. So you got that phosphate part. Phosphorus is found in DNA and RNA, very important. And before we begin, just want to let you know that phosphorus does not have an atmospheric phase. So unlike the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus don't really begin in the atmosphere. They do not begin in the atmosphere. They begin in the ground as rocks. Let's begin. So imagine if we have these rocks containing phosphorus, and they're buried deep into the ground. Now, over a long period of time, what's going to happen is these rocks are going to move up to the surface. And weather, like let's say lightning or rain, it's eventually going to break these rocks down. And this is a process known as uplift and weathering. Rocks from beneath go above, and then they get broken down. And when the rocks get broken down, the phosphorus from the rocks will be released into the soil. So we are at the dissolving soil part. We just said that phosphorus can be used as a fertilizer. It's in fertilizers. So it's essential for plant growth, which means that when the phosphorus is dissolved in the soil, well, plants can use this phosphorus to grow. And this takes us to terrestrial food webs. Because what can happen is that if you have a human that eats the phosphorus, eats the plant containing phosphorus, and then the human eventually dies, well, when the human dies, the phosphorus from the dead human gets released back into the soil. So that's the terrestrial food webs part. Basically, an animal eats another animal that has phosphorus, and then when that animal dies, it's going to release the phosphorus back into the soil. So you'll notice how there's a cycle, there's this land cycle right over here. But phosphorus can also go into the ocean. Phosphorus can also go into the ocean. And you have things like algae. That use phosphorus as well. You have animals that eat algae, and then you have a food chain there. So for example, if we have phosphorus right over here, these black dots, right, and it's absorbed by algae, and then the fish eats algae. You have the fish that eats algae, and then the fish eventually dies. Well, the fish will release the phosphorus that it gained from the algae back into the ocean. Okay. Now, an important thing to know about phosphorus is that it does not dissolve in water. It's insoluble, meaning that if you got phosphorus in the water, what's going to happen is it's just going to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And over a long period of time, it turns back into rocks. So that's the phosphorus cycle, basically. Now, there's a couple of problems, and us humans cause these problems. What happens is that us humans sometimes use too much fertilizers, and that can cause, well, something called runoff. You got so much phosphorus, you have a lot of phosphorus going to the ocean because we use it as fertilizer, and that can cause algal blooms, which we talked about earlier, right? It's when you have an excess amount of algae, and then all of them start growing, and then the oxygen levels decrease, which can cause hypoxia. So yeah, this can also cause the same problem as nitrogen because they're a little too effective. They're a little too broken for plants. And yeah, that's basically the phosphorus cycle. There's also this aerosol part. I know I just said that phosphorus doesn't really have an atmospheric phase, but I mean, technically it does, but I mean, this aerosol. It's this aerosol part. Basically, things like burning fossil fuels. Things like burning fossil fuels or using fertilizer, as I said before. If you have like wind that's blowing, right? What can happen is that phosphorus from fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels also contain a little bit of phosphorus. Or you have fertilizers, right? All of these can be blown up to the sky by winds and transported into any one of these sections. So phosphorus from fossil fuels can be blown into the ocean or it can be blown onto land. This can also occur naturally by like volcanoes and stuff. But yeah, that's a really small part. But yeah, phosphorus cycle, I mean, technically it has atmospheric. Let's talk about the water cycle. So the water cycle is driven by the sun. And y'all probably heard of the three terms of the water cycle: evaporation, condensation, precipitation. Basically, what happens is you have a water source, and the sun evaporates the water, so it goes up in the sky. It condenses into a cloud. The cloud can move all around, but the main thing is that the cloud, it's eventually going to rain, it's going to release all the water, and then the water can go back into, it will eventually go back into like the ocean, for example. Just a couple of extra things to know here. Evaporation from plants is called transpiration because plants, they also have water in them, and the water can be evaporated, right? So the water from this plant can be evaporated into the sky. That's transpiration. The hotter it is, the more evaporation there is. So if it was a really hot day, well, there would be more evaporation. The transpiration rate of this plant would increase. What's another thing? All right, runoff. Yeah, runoff is basically when, let's say, it starts raining, and this rain right over here doesn't soak into the soil. You see, whenever it's raining, right, if you have, let's say, a cloud here, and it starts raining, right, a lot of the water is going to seep into the soil. But runoff is basically when that does not happen, when the water does not soak into the soil. And you'll notice how if there was a cloud here and it started raining, it would instead land on this mountain. And this can cause stuff like avalanches because it doesn't soak into this mountain, right? It can cause avalanches if it's snowing, for example, stuff like that. You also have infiltration. Infiltration is just when this water, it can go into the soil and it can transport, it can move all the nutrients around, which is very useful for the plants. And stuff that humans do that disturb the cycle is cutting down trees, right? Imagine if we cut this tree. Well, the water from this tree, all right, ain't really gonna evaporate because if I have a dead tree right over here, a lot of the water is actually gonna soak into the soil. So whenever humans cut off trees, like in forests, for example, the transpiration rate decreases. So that disturbs the water cycle. I think that's pretty much it. It's pretty much all you have to know. Sublimation, I mean, it's pretty rare. This thing only occurs when it's really hot. It's when you have stuff like ice and it immediately turns into a gas. So sublimation is when you go from a solid to a gas in one step. You skip the liquid phase. It occurs when it's really hot. And deposition is the opposite of that. You go directly from a gas to the solid phase. And I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. You just have to know evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and I'm pretty sure you're going to be completely fine. Well, let's talk a little bit more about plants. But before we do that, quick fun fact. 1% of fresh water on Earth, 1% of water on Earth is fresh water. And most of that is found in glaciers and ice caps. Okay. Plants. Important for ecosystems. They produce the energy they produce the energy like glucose from photosynthesis, and then other animals eat that, and then they get energy, and then you got the food chain. So the food chain looks something like this. let's say you have animal X eating plants, you have animal Y eating animal X, and you have animal Z eating animal Y. So this is an example of a food chain. And plants provide the basic structure for this food chain. Without plants, well, animal X would die of starvation. Animal Y would die of starvation because animal X dies of starvation, and you see this cycle continues on. And these arrows right over here, you might be wondering, if you have like a food chain, for example, let's say if animal X eats animal Y, well, why does the arrow point towards animal X? It looks like animal Y is eating animal X, right? For example, we know that animal X eats plants, but in this diagram, it looks like plants eat animal X. So why is the arrow pointed towards the predator? And that's because it shows the transfer of energy. Basically, it shows that the energy from the plants is going to animal X. The energy from animal X is going to animal Y because animal Y eats animal X. All right, now let's talk about gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. So the gross primary productivity basically tells you how productive is a plant. How much photosynthesis does this plant do? So for example, if we have a couple of plants on this field, well, gross primary productivity would basically tell you how much photosynthesis is going on in that area. All right. Now, before we talk about net primary productivity, you gotta know what biomass means. Biomass just means the total, total weight, or what's a good way to phrase this? The total mass of all the living organisms in an area. So biomass just means the biomass is just the total mass of all the living things in the area. So for example, if I have a human in this area and it weighs 10 pounds, and I have a cow and it weighs 10 pounds, well, the total biomass of this area, well, that would be 20 pounds, right? You would just add up all the pounds of the living organisms. 10 plus 10 is 20. So that's biomass. Pretty straightforward. Now, the net primary productivity basically measures, well, how much does a plant grow? How much does a plant grow over a certain period of time? All right, that's net primary productivity. How much does a plant grow over a certain period of time? And that is measured by taking the total amount of photosynthesis and subtracting it by the total amount of cellular respiration that a plant does. Now, why does this work? So if I'm talking about all these plants in the area, right? And when these plants undergo photosynthesis, what photosynthesis essentially does is it allows the plants to grow. So if all these plants are doing photosynthesis, their biomass is increasing, right? They're growing. However, plants undergo cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, when plants undergo cellular respiration, their biomass is decreasing. They're sacrificing some of their biomass in order to perform the plant's essential functions. So the net primary productivity, if we want to measure how much does a plant grow over a certain period of time, it's going to be equal to the amount that it gains minus the amount that it loses from respiration, right? The amount of biomass that it gains from photosynthesis minus the amount of biomass that it loses from respiration. So that kind of makes sense that this is the formula for net primary productivity. So what are some factors that affect net primary productivity? I'd like you to think of 3. Well, what you're basically asking, I'm basically asking you, what are some things that affect how fast the plant grows? And most obvious one, sunlight. Without sun, there's no photosynthesis. The more sunlight a plant has, more photosynthesis it does. Also have temperature. Some plants thrive in hotter temperatures. You also have light. No, not light. Sorry, just said that. Water. You need water for your plants. Also, you have like nutrients in the soil, right? Nutrients in the soil. So maybe I can say something like soil quality. Soil quality. If you're using stuff like fertilizers, obviously, plant's going to grow faster. So yeah, anything, Basically, the stuff that the plant needs to thrive, like the main stuff, that's the stuff that affects the net primary productivity of plants in an area. All right, let's talk more about the food chain. I'm jumping around here, so forgive me. So this is something called the 10% rule. 10% rule. Now in a food chain, you have the producers, which are just the plants. You have the producers. Then you have the primary consumers. Primary consumers. I'm just going to call it P consumers. Primary consumers are the things that eat the producers. They're the herbivores. Then you have secondary consumer. Secondary consumer. They're the things that eat the primary consumer. And then finally, you have the tertiary tertiary. I know there can be more levels to the food chain, but this is probably what a lot of food chains look like. You have these 4 levels, and then each level eats the level beneath it. Now, the 10% rule basically states that if let's say I eat a plant, if I eat a plant, the total amount of energy that I get from a plant is 10% of the plant's total energy. So if this plant in total has 100, let's say, calories of energy, I'm only going to get 10 calories worth of energy from this plant. I'm going to get only 10% of the plant's total energy. That's the 10% rule. So obviously, as you move up these levels, you're getting less and less energy from the level beneath it. Getting less and less energy from the level beneath it. And this is due to because when you're eating food, a lot of the energy from the food is lost as heat.